Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, very much appreciated. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Hit the subscribe button because that gives me a nice warm fuzzy feeling inside. Yeah, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. That'd be really cool. So leading on from last week's episode of the show, I'm looking at another independent bottling company, this time James Eadie. It's kind of like a sort of an annual thing. I think I'd probably do 2 episodes of the show at least on their releases. This was the today I'll be looking at the spring releases of this year, and as you probably remember, last week I mentioned the fact that a lot of the independent bottling companies tend to be bottling the same distilleries and therefore using sort of lots of weird and wonderful finishes, and obviously, as you well know, with James Eadie they do indeed use a lot of finishes, although yes, I suppose you could argue that they do them to make a point of difference, but also it's tied in with the history of the company. Obviously, when James Eadie himself was bottling whiskey, he used a lot of these casks that they're using today, and that was because back in the 1800s you couldn't just phone up, you know, Senor Miguel or whoever in Jerez and order a truckload of sherry butts. That just didn't happen. Basically, the whiskey industry had to use what was available, and obviously at the time, things like cognac, armagnac, sherry, Madeira, Marsala, etc., were all shipped to the UK in barrel and then bottled over here. So once that was done, the barrels were obviously no longer needed, which is why the whiskey industry was using these barrels. I also imagine they were using beer barrels. They were probably using barrels made from both English and Scottish oak, I would imagine, literally scavenging whatever they could get their hands on. And so yes, there is historical preference or precedent for using those types of casks, and I mean, you know, it wasn't until, you know, 1900s really that a lot of distilleries started to use American oak casks once that kind of trade, shall we say, was introduced. And so yeah, it's quite funny actually when I get sent an email by one of the independents. They'll often sort of put a little caveat at the end saying there may well be a few that are not up your street, and you know which ones they are, don't you? Anyway, I'm going to review them. I mean, you know, all whiskies have their place. I mean, you know, as you well know, I am a little bit critical of whiskies that don't have the balance, and that can be for a number of reasons, but predominantly the reason is just too much oak, too much intensity of the finishing cask, that kind of thing. So yeah, always keen to have a look at James Eadie's bottlings. As you know, they do 3 separate ranges. They have the small batch range, which is generally speaking 3 casks of the same whiskey vatted together. They then do obviously the single cask range, which again self-explanatory, and then they have their cask finishes range, which again self-explanatory, I guess. So looking at the lineup for today, there is obviously some of those releases in each of those 3 ranges, so not really a great deal else to say about the company, so we'll just crack on and have a look at today's lineup. So we're going to kick off with the 2 small batch bottlings. I mean, I like the small batch bottlings. They're predominantly American oak, which is really good. They're predominantly relatively young, but they're also, I think, a really good value for money as well. They're not too expensive. So we're going to kick off with the 9-year-old Miltonduff. This is called the Traveller's Rest. As you may or may not know, the company have been using the pub names that James Eadie used to own as sort of, you know, labels for the small batch range. So this is called the Traveller's Rest. It's, like I said, 9-year-old Miltonduff. It's 3 first fill and refill bourbon hogsheads, casks 1151, cask 800697 and cask 800700. So I'm guessing 1 first fill and 2 refills. It's bottled at 46% and was bottled this year. Bottling number 2 is called King Charles in the Oak. It's a 9-year-old Royal Brackla. Again, same combination of casks, first fill and recharred bourbon hoggies. Actually, no, sorry, this is recharred bourbon hoggies. The previous one was refill bourbon hoggies. So casks number 1596, 302353 and 302355, bottled obviously this year. Then we're going to move on to the cask finishes. I mean, will you look at the colour of that? I mean, you know, that's kind of absorbing the light. And I know that at a recent tasting it kind of went down a bomb. So this is the cask finishes 10-year-old Aberlour. Cask number 367497, initially matured in American oak, and then 12 months finishing in first fill Oloroso hoggies. Or hogshead I should say, bottled at 58.8%, and yeah, like I said, we'll see whether there's any distillery character there or not, shall we. Next one we'll be looking at is the cask finishes Glendullan. Yeah, just my little joke there. So this was an 11-year-old distilled in 2011. It's cask number 367834, and it has spent 10 months finishing in ex-first fill Malaga hogshead. Then we're moving on to, hang on, I've lost my place, that one, this one I should say, this is the cask finishes Strathmill. It's 13 years old, and it's a vatting of 2 casks, which is unusual for the cask finishes range. They'll probably tell me that that isn't quite the case, but it does seem to be that most of the cask finishes do tend to be single cask bottlings. So this is 2 casks, numbers 367345 and 367346, and both finished for 12 months in first fill Oloroso quarter casks. Bottled at 55.2%. And the final bottling of the day is a bit of peat. Excellent. So this is the single cask Ardnamurchan. Now, I don't know whether there's been any other independent bottlings of Ardnamurchan. Certainly this is the first one that I've come across. It's 6 years old, was distilled in 2016. It's bottled at the the light ABV of 61.2%, and it is a refill bourbon barrel, cask number 911. So that will conclude the show in due course. So let's kick off with a bit of the Traveller's Rest.
I just know this is the way to what
Right, okay, so 9-year-old Miltonduff. Let's see what the nose gives us on this one, shall we? Ooh, that's not very Miltonduff, it has to be said. It's actually, I mean, not that I dislike Miltonduff, I do like Miltonduff in actual fact. But this is really estery, loads of pineapple, apricot, peach, straw. Not getting very much of that kind of Miltonduffy, herbally kind of character that I often get. And again, it's kind of like, you know, feeds into that whole sort of idea of distilleries throwing off casks that don't quite meet their flavour profile. There's certainly a lot of oak, but it's under control. The first fill oak is certainly noticeable. It's got lots of lightly creamy vanilla, touch of spice, a little bit of sort of citrus, green citrus developing now. There is an element of herbalness coming through as it's had time in the glass, but certainly giving it a bit of aeration, and you get a big whack of estery fruit, which is lovely. I think this just ticks all my boxes. Beautifully balanced estery fruit, lovely, and not too expensive either. Touch of earth now coming through as well. Lovely complexity, it really is. Let's see what the pal's like. As an explosion of fruit in the mouth, as we said, very much like the nose. Estery, juicy, fruity, apricot, white, peach, pear, apple, touch of honey. Oak is bittering a little bit on the mid palate and towards the finish, but I'm not sort of too upset about that. It is kind of adding a sort of a nice counterbalance to all that big juicy fruit. There's a touch of barley, a little bit of a leafiness. The alcohol is kind of well contained, but it really does give it quite a nice punch on the finish. Adds a little bit of spice as well. Not as hugely oaked as the nose. There is an element of vanilla, a little bit of toffee, but not a lot. And overall, I think that's a lovely whisky. Beautifully balanced, lovely fruit, lovely complexity, good progression, and like I said, not particularly expensive in the general scheme of things, I should say. So yeah, really good stuff. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 9-year-old Royal Brackla. Let's see whether the nose gives us on this end, shall we? It's a little bit on the shy side. You kind of have to work the nose. It's got a little bit of barley, but a lot of oak charred oak. Touch of apricot, a little bit of cigar leaf, almond paste. It's all right. It's kind of it's not blowing me away like the Miltonduff did. It has to be said. It's like I said. It's kind of slightly overly oily, I think, is the problem. Now, a bit of a dumb thing to say, but it does seem to be sort of almost suppressing the aromas. But the overriding factor again is the charred oak. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as saying it's unbalanced, but it's the spirit is not really giving me an awful lot here. Let's see what pass on. Soft, simple, straightforward, vanilla, bit of barley, slightly oily. A little bit of citrus kind of comes through on the finish. A little bit of bittering oak as well. You can really taste the charred oak, and again, it's okay. It's pleasant. It's not unbalanced. It's not particularly complex. And it, to me, like I said, it doesn't really excite me as much as the Miltonduff did, and yeah, that's sort of a question mark kind of one. Like I said, when I kind of like taste the whiskies, and certainly if I've got my buying head on, which I obviously do when I'm tasting them first time, it's basically a tick across or a question mark, and the question mark is normally a case of, well, I'm undecided, and maybe I kind of go back to it and just give it a retaste, and then decide one way or the other. And sometimes, sometimes they need, you need to sort of, retaste something. I mean, obviously, like I said to you guys, I always often initially will go with gut feeling, certainly on a whiskey when I'm tasting it, what it really sort of says to me sort of first time round, and often it takes quite a bit for me to sort of change my mind from one way or the other. So it's normally a case of I kind of get the impression and I get the sort of like the feeling sort of straight off, and this one just didn't quite sort of match up for me, it has to be said.
I can be a steady rock.
Right, okay, so let's move on to the cask finished Aberlour. So first fill Oloroso finish. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Well, I think if you like the Abunda bottling, you're going to wet yourself over this, it has to be said. It's a sherry monster. It's raisinated fruit, treacle, black olive, black grape, black licorice, black fruit, black, dark, dense, distillery character 0. There's a little bit of a herbalness, there's black pepper. I mean, it's incredibly clean. There's no blemishes there whatsoever, but it's all about the sherry, and it's like I said, you know, it's, if you love this kind of whiskey, then you're gonna love it, you know. And for me, there's no balance there whatsoever. There's no, it's all about the sherry, and you could say that that comes from any distillery at the end of the day. See what that's like. Quite sweet, again, very much like the palate, like the nose. Black fruit, black olives, raisinated fruit, prune, bitters quite hard on the mid palate. It's kind of emphasised by the alcohol, and it's got a bit of green wood and earth in the finish. I mean, yeah, it's, you know what I'm going to say about this kind of whiskey. It is just not my thing whatsoever. But it is very clean. It's very clean, and it's very Oloroso at the end of the day. Let's see what happens with a little drop of water. It makes it a little lighter. There's maybe a little bit more toasty oak, a little bit more citrus maybe, but it's become sort of, I would say, less complex, a little bit more homogeneous and sherried. I mean, let's see what the pound side. Very much the same. Nice and spicy now, it has to be said. Really emphasise the spices. They're sort of cinnamony, sort of black peppery kind of spices. Yeah, okay, so like I said, if you like a big cherry monster, it ticks all your boxes. If you don't like a big cherry monster, you ain't going to love it. Simple as that. So let's move on to the Glendullan. First fill Malaga hogshead finish. Let's see what the nose gives on this then, shall we? Interesting. Again, predominantly about the cask, so I'm getting sort of sultana, dried white grape, peanut, green olives. You can really smell the kind of dried fruit. It's got a little bit of dried apricot as well, peach. Yeah, okay. I kind of can get into this, although like it is really heavy on the Malaga notes. There isn't a huge amount of Glendullan character, whatever Glendullan's character actually is, but there's a touch of barley. You can argue that there's a sort of a modicum of balance going on, but it is pretty much about the cask, and it's maybe a little bit more interesting to me than Oloroso, it has to be said. Maybe because it's just not quite so widely used. I don't know. It's just, yeah, slightly more appealing. Let's see what the pass like. Again, fairly heavily cask influenced. White grape, green olives, touch of dates maybe. Yeah, very grapey. Slightly biscuity note coming through on the mid palate. Spice, almond. Again, there's no real distillery character coming through there. I mean, you know, Glendullan does tend to be sort of in the light kind of, you know, green fruit sort of herbal spey kind of character, and I honestly wouldn't have expected it to sort of like, you know, give an awful lot given 10 months in the finishing cask. But it's kind of interesting, I suppose. You know, as a retailer, you know, you want to have a variety of different bottlings on the shelf, you know, and so, you know, you do have some sherry monsters, you do have some of these kind of finished Malaga cask finish or Madeira cask or whatever, you know, even though it's not kind of something that I would rave about, you know. I'm going to put a little drop of water with it, see if that maybe just dials down some of the cask. Yeah, I get an intimation of barley. It's a little bit more aromatic. It's still fairly heavily sort of Malaga grapey influences. A little sweeter, possibly. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. It is what it is at the end of the day, I suppose. Let's see what the pass like. Okay, there's a little bit of, dare I say, indistinct spirit character. It's, you know, it's not sort of, it gives you a little bit of a kind of, there's a little bit of barley, there's a little bit of more spirity kind of notes. The cask influence is lessened a little bit. It's slightly sweeter, it's still quite biscuity, grapey. Yeah, okay, I can kind of go with this. It's sort of, you know, again, like I said, it's not, Glendullan is not the most sort of like, you know, obvious of, you know, if you had it in American oak, you know, and you didn't know what it was, would you have picked it for Glendullan? I mean, unlikely, but so yeah, okay, I can work with that. It's okay. Okay, let's move on to the 13-year-old Strathmill. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Oh, okay, so no Strathmill character whatsoever. I mean, Strathmill's a beautiful whiskey. I mean, beautifully orangey and fruity, and it can be quite exuberant. And do I get any of that? No. I mean, it's not as monstrous as the Aberlour, but and although it's first fill Oloroso quart casks, it feels more like it's been finished in refill casks. It's tobacco leaf, slightly lighter, more kind of sultanery dried fruits, dried citrus, dried orange, a little bit of spice. I mean, it's pretty intense, it has to be said. There's a sort of tobacco leaf note, and like you can smell the cask. Although not overtly tannic, you can smell those tannins. They are definitely there. Yeah, I mean, you do sort of like think, well, why Strathmill? I mean, maybe the casks, you know, and I'm being sort of a little bit sort of like devil's advocate here. Maybe they weren't quite as Strathmill as one would hope, and it was a kind of, well, what are we going to do? Let's finish them in Oloroso. I mean, I'm being a bit disingenuous, I guess. But you know, it's kind of like, you know, Strathmill's such a beautiful whiskey. When it's on song, you know, that you would want to just bottle it as it is, American oak. Oh, but anyway, let's see what that's like. Relatively soft, simple. Like I said, again, we're in the more sultanery dried fruit end of the spectrum, dried citrus. Again, quite tannic, but those tannins are relatively soft and they're not too bitter. In actual fact, they're not really bitter at all. They're just very tannic, you know. A little bit spicy, a little bit of raisin coming through on the finish, a touch of almond. Yeah, okay, it's just kind of not saying an awful lot to me. It's kind of, you know, because I know what Strathmill is like, it has no distillery character, it is just about those quarter casks, and again, like I say, you can taste the tannins, although, like I said, the tannins aren't harsh, they are quite soft, but they are, you know, pretty noticeable nevertheless. Let's try a little drop of water and see if that does anything. Okay, it does lighten the sherry a little bit, but it's still no distillery character. It's got a nice aromatic quality to it, and again, it's kind of, if you like this type of whiskey, then you're going to like it. You know, it's very clean. There's no sulphur. You know, no overt sort of off notes. But again, I'm not the character of the spirit is not kind of coming through. it's homogenous. It is a bit bland, it has to be said. It's kind of like, yeah, right, okay, refill sherry kind of characteristics, you know, very difficult to sort of pinpoint specific sort of flavours. It's just very much sherry. And again, like I said, it's not sort of something that really excites me in, at all. But, for some of you guys, I'm sure you would kind of like really, really love this kind of stuff. But for me, there's no distillery character there. The sherry is kind of too overt, too blanketing and not augmenting. So, yeah, on that count, yeah.
Only my shadows follow.
Okay, so let's move on to the final whisky of this afternoon. We're not quite afternoon yet. Ooh, brew for breakfast, as they say. Anyway, so this is the Ardnamurchan. So in brackets they put peated. So as you know, Ardnamurchan does peated and unpeated and vats them together, but this is their peated spirit. So, ooh. Now that does it for me, it has to be said, even at sort of 11 o'clock in the morning. Gristy, tarry, lovely sweet herbal heathery peat, lemon, coffee, black pepper, touch of rose oil. I mean, it's that youthful note, but I mean, it just adds. It's not kind of like going, I'm young raw spirit. It's going, I'm raw young spirit, but it's kind of integrated with all the other characteristics. A little bit of milky vanilla. I mean, considering this is 60 odd percent ABV, that alcohol is really well contained. That's a kind of a dangerous whiskey, it has to be said. It's just got so much character. I mean, this is what I love about Ardnamurchan. It is young, but it's not. It's effusive. It's just an incredible spirit at the end of the day. And I have yet to come across a poor bottling of Ardnamurchan. And there's not too many distilleries that I can say that about at all. It's just got buckets of character. Yes, it's heavily peated. It's slightly slightly more heavily peated than their sort of core bottling, but I mean, I remember tasting one of their core releases, not core releases, one of their sort of limited edition releases, which was a lot more heavily peated. And this has got a lovely whack of peat, but it's got no saltiness, there's no coastalness, it's just that dry highland peat kind of character. And now, it is expensive, and you're going to go sort of like 80 odd quid for a 6-year-old whiskey, and you have to wonder why it's so expensive. And it's probably because Ardnamurchan are kind of I wouldn't go say as far as saying as profiteering here, but they're obviously charging a premium price for their casks, and when the quality is this good, you kind of like go, yeah, okay. Let's see the last one. Yeah, that's 60 odd percent alcohol, it has to be said. Gristy, barleyed, a little bit more oak, more vanilla, more sort of custard powder, rich, earthy, dark, dry peat, manure-y peat, a little bit of, quite a bit of manure in actual fact. I mean, it's got a real sort of masked finish. It's got that sort of intense kind of minerally feeling, but there's this lovely kind of crumbly peat aftertaste. It's kind of like, although the finish is masked and it kind of stops intensely, you then go on to get this kind of pause, and the aftertaste is just a sort of crumbly, earthy kind of peat. Wow, intense, stunning whiskey, it has to be said, and that is real testament to the distillery itself, I think. Let's put a little drop of water with it and see what that does to it. little bit fresher, rounder, a little bit more citrus, a little bit more oak as well, but it's kind of like sort of subdued vanilla, I guess. Still got that lovely peaty character. I mean, the peat has kind of not succumbed to the dilution at all. A little bit more lime as well. I mean, that's just a lovely nose. It's just a stunning nose, it has to be said. This is what floats my boat, proverbially, as they say. Let's see what that's like. Raw, intense, but got this lovely oiliness, this softness, as vanilla spice. The peat is kind of not quite so intense. It's more kind of again sort of dusty and slightly gritty, but it's just wonderfly soft. It's long, it's young, but it's not too young. I mean, this is the stuff that floats my boat, it has to be said, you know. And there is often just something to be said for basically putting it in an American oak cask and just leaving it, let it get on with it, and we end up with sort of such a gorgeous spirit, you know. Like I said, I mean, I know that sort of like the whole whiskey landscape would be really boring and dull if everything was like this, but you know, this just sings to me, it talks to me, it just says what the spirit is about. It's not over encumbered with oak. The oak is more supportive, it's adding, you know, a sort of a structure to the whiskey, and this is what really floats my boat at the end of the day, you know. The whole balance is there, and it is just absolutely stunning, and it's a testament, like I said, to the quality of the spirit that's been produced at the distillery, and the fact that it can be bottled at this age. And you know, I love that. That is just a stunning whiskey.
I'm struggling.
Okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. Like I said, big thank you to James Eadie for the samples for today's episode of the show. You know, I've done enough episodes of the show on their whiskey and to know. Okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. Firstly, a big thank you to James Eadie for the samples for this week's episode of the show. Obviously, they have been sent more in a commercial sense rather than sort of just for an episode of the show. But you know, it kind of goes hand in hand. I mean, and yeah, I love what the company are doing. At the end of the day, I'm a big fan of their whiskies. Some, obviously, I'm more of a fan of than others. And the Miltonduff was just absolutely my kind of whiskey at the end of the day. Lovely, juicy, fruity, estery, lots of character, albeit maybe not your expected Miltonduff kind of character, but at the end of the day, I don't really care. It's just, you know, it's all about the juice in the bottle, and the juice in the bottle is bloody good. The Royal Brackla, not quite so effusive about it, has to be said. It was kind of okay. It was a bit kind of, so-so. It was the classic kind of question mark kind of whiskey, and at the end of the day, it was kind of like, yeah, right, okay. I much prefer the Miltonduff. It's the sort of whiskey that I would love to get behind, and you know, if a customer comes in the shop and basically says, I want a lovely whiskey for around about sort of like 40 odd quid, you go, well, you can't go too wrong with that. I wouldn't sort of go, I wouldn't, you know, want to kind of get behind the Royal Brackla. So that's kind of where we're at with that. The Aberlour, well, yeah, I know there's a lot of you out there that loves that kind of sort of like big sherry monster, and I'm afraid I'm not one of them. So we'll quickly move on then, I guess. The Glendullan was kind of like, well, yeah, possibly a little bit over sort of Malaga cask, but it's an interesting cask. to use, and it, you know, as a kind of a retailer, you kind of want, you know, you want something kind of slightly different to entice customers in, and as long as it's not complete and utter crap, you know, then great, it works. The Strathmill, to me, was really disappointing. I mean, purely from a sort of like a knowledge of what Strathmill's character can be like. To me, it was just like, you know, just none of that. No distillery character whatsoever. All cask, and just really quite disappointing at the end of the day. There was no balance, and you know. But I guess there's going to be people out there that kind of love that kind of stuff. And without a shadow of a doubt, standout bottling had to be the Ardnamurchan. I mean, yeah, it's young, but it just has so much character. Its intensity. It's got that lovely peaty character. I mean, obviously, if you don't like peat, then you're never going to like it. So you know, that one out the window. But for me, it just had so much going for it. It was just frankly stunning. And if you love your peated Highland whiskies, buy a bottle of that. I mean, you know, buy a bottle of that and buy a bottle of the Miltonduff. I mean, you know, there you go. You're absolutely sorted. So that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. Hope you've enjoyed it. I mean, again, I'd like to think that I've given you a kind of like a balanced review. And you know, at the end of the day, I always encourage you to basically, you know, try these whiskies. You know, they might not necessarily be my cup of tea, but they may well be your kind of cup of tea, so to speak. Whether that's kind of like Darjeeling or Earl Grey, I hasten to add. Anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. All I have to say is, it's not quite afternoon yet, but good afternoon and good dramming.